Hello, I'm Ben, and you're watching The PhD Parent. For mums, when it comes to working out how often and for how long they're going to breastfeed their baby, the types of approaches used fall into two different categories. One is baby-led or on-demand breastfeeding, and the other is scheduled or timed breastfeeding. Baby-led breastfeeding is breastfeeding in which there are no restrictions on how often or for how long a baby is breastfed. In other words, the kid is breastfed whenever they're hungry and for however long they seem to want. Although the World Health Organization puts two caveats on this. First of all, that babies should be breastfed if they've slept for too long, for example, wake the baby after 4 hours to feed them, or if mum has too much milk in her breasts. Scheduled breastfeeding, as the name suggests, is when babies are breastfed according to a predetermined schedule, for example, every 3 to 4 hours, and potentially also for a specific amount of time, or whether the baby is offered one or both breasts. Currently, for healthy babies, baby-led breastfeeding is the recommended approach, for example, by the World Health Organization. Now, a reasonable question to ask is, why is this approach recommended? So as you'll see, there are reasons to think that baby-led breastfeeding is a better approach than scheduled breastfeeding, and vice versa. But there's currently little strong evidence to support either position. So which is better, baby-led or scheduled breastfeeding? We'll first consider why baby-led breastfeeding may be better than scheduled breastfeeding. Now, one reason people argue this is that baby's demand for breast milk regulates the amount of milk mum produces. Thus, the idea is that by feeding the baby according to its natural level of demand, it's more likely that there will be enough milk available to meet this demand. Another reason is that baby-led breastfeeding does not impose any limits on contact between mum and baby, which may help nurture the bond between them. And lastly, if the baby is feeding regularly, this might provide reassurance or encouragement for mum, thereby increasing the chances that breastfeeding continues. But now consider why scheduled breastfeeding might be better than baby-led breastfeeding. One of the arguments for this is that when a baby feeds regularly, as part of the baby-led approach, this might be misinterpreted by mum as her not having enough milk, leading to the discontinuation of breastfeeding. Another reason is that scheduled breastfeeding allows mum to structure a day in ways that help her get other things done, which may increase the chances of her breastfeeding exclusively. Finally, scheduled breastfeeding may reduce the potential of baby going too long without milk. So there are potential upsides and downsides to each approach. Now, as mentioned, baby-led breastfeeding is the recommended approach. And of course, it's best if recommendations are based upon consideration of the evidence. So what is the evidence that supports this recommendation? To my surprise, apparently there's little such evidence. In the following, I'll describe what evidence there is. So in the World Health Organization's Evidence for the 10 Steps to Successful Breastfeeding, which is one early source where baby-led breastfeeding was recommended, the World Health Organization considered 5 studies. As will be seen across these studies, the results support the recommendation that baby-led breastfeeding is the way to go. But each study has its problems. So first of all, Illingworth and Stone had mums in one ward of a hospital feed their child using a baby-led approach, and mums in a different ward feed their child using a scheduled approach, where babies were fed every 4 hours. The researchers found that, compared to scheduled breastfeeding, baby-led breastfeeding was associated with greater weight gain, fewer breastfeeding problems such as sore nipples, and a higher likelihood of exclusive breastfeeding. However, there are at least 3 problems with this study. First, it's not clear how mums were assigned to wards. That is, whether they were randomly assigned or whether assignment was systematic in some way. Second, there was a confound between breastfeeding approach and hospital ward. That is, one type of breastfeeding happened in one ward and the other happened in a different ward. Therefore, any differences between the breastfeeding approaches could be explained by differences between the wards. For example, maybe the nursing staff in one ward were more supportive than the other. And third, while not a problem with the study as such, the impact of the 2 different breastfeeding approaches was assessed only across a relatively short period, and primarily within a hospital setting. Thus, the results can't be extrapolated to what might happen when mums are at home and are breastfeeding for several months. So next, D. Carvalho had mums who delivered in July and August feed their child using a scheduled approach, where babies were fed every 3 to 4 hours, and they had mums who delivered in September and October feed their child using a baby-led approach. After about 2 weeks of feeding, babies in the latter group were drinking more breast milk, about 200 ml, and they'd gained more weight, about 200 grams. But after about 5 weeks, these differences were no longer evident. In a subset of participants from each group, D. Carvalho looked at nipple soreness in mums 10 days after the birth of the child, and they found no differences between the groups. So these results suggest that baby-led breastfeeding may be better in the early stages of a kid's life. But in this study, there was no evidence that this approach produces a lasting impact, and unlike the previous study, no evidence that it has an impact on reducing nipple soreness. Like the previous study, a problem with this one is that mums were not randomly assigned to breastfeeding condition. And there's also a confound between breastfeeding approach and time period. That is scheduled breastfeeding for kids born in July and August versus baby-led breastfeeding for kids born in September and October. Therefore, in principle, any differences between the breastfeeding approaches could be explained by differences in date of birth rather than the type of breastfeeding approach adopted. Next, the study by Slavin and Harvey looked at baby-led breastfeeding with respect to the duration rather than frequency of feeds. Specifically, mums in one set of wards were instructed to breastfeed for as long as they thought appropriate, which is not quite baby-led breastfeeding, but close enough. Whereas mums in another set of wards were instructed to breastfeed for a specified time per breast, scheduled breastfeeding. When babies were 6 weeks old, the researchers found that a higher proportion of mums in the former group were still breastfeeding. There were no differences between the groups in terms of breastfeeding problems, and this study had problems like the previous ones. Specifically, it was not clear if mums were randomly assigned to the wards, and there was a confound between breastfeeding approach and hospital ward. Finally, Martinez found that baby-led breastfeeding was associated with a longer duration of breastfeeding compared to scheduled breastfeeding. However, this study was correlational, and so you can't draw the conclusion that baby-led breastfeeding was driving the longer duration of breastfeeding. So in summary, the results of these studies are generally consistent with the idea that baby-led breastfeeding is a better approach than scheduled breastfeeding, at least with respect to duration of breastfeeding and baby growth. Having said that, first, it's not clear how long these benefits are evident for. Based on the results of DiCarvalho, they may only be short-lived. Second, none of the studies used a design where participants were randomized to one or other of the breastfeeding approaches. Randomized trials are generally considered the gold standard for determining whether one thing is better than another. The reasons behind this are discussed in another video, and you can check out the link below. Third, there are only a handful of studies to go by. Fallon, in 2016, carried out a review of the research, but they considered the same studies that I just did. I looked to see whether any randomized trials had been published since Fallon's review, but there didn't seem to be any. So in conclusion, to reiterate, the only reasonable conclusion is that the evidence suggests that baby-led breastfeeding is a better approach than scheduled breastfeeding. There's certainly no evidence to suggest the opposite. However, I don't reckon this conclusion can be made with confidence, as the evidence base is lacking. As researchers often say, more studies are needed, and that's certainly true in this case. So that's it for baby-led versus scheduled breastfeeding. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.